Well, hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Wes Moore, and welcome to Macroeconomics session number 11. In this session, we're going to talk about something that is discussed in the culture quite often these days, the concept of the living wage. The living wage. Is this a good idea from an economic standpoint or not? In this session, we'll just cover two things. First, we'll talk about what is a living wage. We'll answer the question and define the idea or the concept of a living wage. And then secondly, we will look at some problems associated with the living wage concept. It comes across as a very good idea, but when you analyze it, it's not a good idea at all. And I want to show you some of the weaknesses of this whole idea. So let's get started then with what is a living wage. Well, a living wage is pretty easy to understand. It's basically a minimum wage level, a minimum hourly pay rate that would allow someone to take care of his or her basic needs. That's at least the idea. Now, of course, what is a basic need? What are basic necessities? Those are up for grabs, obviously. But the whole idea is to push the minimum wage up high enough so that people working a minimum wage job can take care of all their expenses. And the goal of the whole living wage idea is to pressure Congress, the U.S. Congress, to pass a minimum wage law that requires every employer to pay that hourly wage. And at this point in time, what's discussed most frequently is $15 an hour. The present minimum wage, I believe, is $7.25 an hour federal, but that does vary by state. You'll have different states with different minimum wage laws in each state. And in economic terms, what a minimum wage is, and the living wage would fall into this because this is essentially just another idea, another term used for a very high minimum wage. What it's called in the economic terms is a price control. A price control. So when we want to talk about and evaluate the living wage idea, we really have to go back and look at the idea of price controls. A price control, in this case, is the government telling companies the minimum they can pay for labor. So we'll get into that more in just a moment here, but this is the idea of the living wage. Now let's look and let's evaluate some problems with the living wage idea and price controls in general. As we talk about this idea, we will also be talking about price controls in general. Now there are two types of price controls. The first type of price control is called a price ceiling. And a price ceiling, as the name would imply, is when the government comes into the market and tells the market the maximum amount they can charge for a particular item. So for example, there's a lot of talk in the culture today about setting prices for prescription drugs, saying that drug companies cannot charge but a certain amount for a certain medical prescription of some type. That's called a price ceiling. It's also known as a price cap. The second type of price control is called a price floor, and that is when a price cannot go below a certain amount. Now the minimum wage laws are an example of price floors, and so the living wage concept also falls under a price floor. But before we talk about price floors, let's talk about the weaknesses of price ceilings. There are essentially three. First of all, price ceilings reduce supply. They reduce the supply of an item that's available. They reduce the quality of items, and they incentivize trickery. Let's look at those a little more deeply. Let's take a price ceiling known as a rent control. A rent control is when the government comes into certain types of housing, usually apartments, and says that the owners of those apartments can only charge so much for rent. There is a rent ceiling. There is a top price set for the rent on these types of apartments. Let's look at these three weaknesses of this price ceiling as it applies to rent controls. Now usually this is in a low-income area and low-income housing. And everybody thinks this is a great idea because we're trying to give the poor more affordable housing. But look at what this does in practical effect in the market. First of all, it reduces the supply. Remember the law of supply. Whenever you reduce the supply of something, are suppliers more or less willing to provide that product, whatever it is? They are less willing because the lower the price, the less profit it is for them and the less incentive they have to produce. So what happens is when you take a set of apartments and you make them rent controlled, owners tend to pull out of those types of properties. They tend to sell them and buy properties that are not rent controlled properties. And then new owners do not get into those properties. So anywhere that there would be a property, an apartment complex that might be subject to a rent control or is in a rent control area, the owners, the people with the wealth to buy those properties and to rent them out to people, will tend to stay away from those because it reduces their amount of profit. So over time what you have is you may have a $500 a month rent maximum, but you will have a shortage of those apartments because the owners, the capital owners, will get out of those businesses, get out of those apartments because they don't want their profits limited. And then you'll have reduced quality. Those who maintain these properties, because they have a cap on their income, essentially, through the rent control, they will reduce the amount of maintenance they do, they will reduce the amount of upkeep, they will essentially try to reduce their costs so that they can still make a profit at that low rent level. This is why you find in typical rent-controlled housing, they're sort of trashy. They're usually not well kept up, they're dirty, they're not painted, the maintenance is always a problem. You reduce quality when you place a rent control or a price ceiling on a product. And then finally, it incentivizes trickery. What you find in practical application is the owners in rent-controlled properties will find clever ways to get more money from their tenants even if they are not charging them the maximum rent that they would like to. For example, they will add new fees. They'll add sign-up fees or other fees that help offset the cost of that lost monthly rent. So this is what happens. Now all of this comes back to this idea we talked about very early in this course, the idea of rational self-interest. Everyone is going to be acting in their own self-interest. They're going to do things that make sense and things that benefit them. The government can come in and control the price of something. They can force a business to charge a certain price or below a certain price. But what they cannot do is control every other thing those people will do in response to that control mechanism. And as we said also in the past, if the government wants to control all of these things, if they want to control the supply and the quality and even the trickery, they have to go in and gain more control over those individuals who are owning those properties and making those decisions. And that is why we do not want socialism. This is socialism right here. When the government comes in and sets the price of something in the market, that is an example of socialism. And the more socialism you have, the more control you give over to the government. So those are the weaknesses of price ceilings in the example of a rent control. Well, let's look at price floors now. Let's look at when the government sets a minimum price for something, like the price of labor. What are the weaknesses there? There are three again. Number one, it increases the costs of those businesses, those suppliers. It eliminates jobs, and it eventually can close businesses. So let's look at this in an example of the minimum wage at a restaurant. Let's say that you own a restaurant or I own a restaurant, and the government comes in and it changes the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour, more than doubling my minimum wage cost. What does that do to my business? Number one, it increases my costs. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Labor is the largest cost in most businesses. You get different statistics for different businesses, but it can be up to 70% of the costs in a business. So when you come in and you double my labor cost, let's say that I'm using mostly minimum wage workers like you would use in a restaurant, and you say, let's just say you double the minimum wage, so you double my labor cost. Well, that cost, if my labor is 70% of my costs, then you just increased my total cost by 35%. And of course that will vary based on the type of business. But you see, when you come in and double labor costs, you really increase the cost of doing business. Also, what you have to remember is that minimum wages, the minimum wage is the basis for the other hourly wages above that. So if I'm making, say, $13 an hour at my job, and the minimum wage in that job is $7.25, then I'm making about $5 more an hour than the minimum wage at my office. So I'm doing well compared to my other fellow employees. But if you come in and raise the minimum from $7 an hour to $15 an hour, then $13 an hour for me is a very poor wage. So not only am I going to want 15, what am I going to want? I'm probably going to want at least 20. So what happens is when you raise this minimum wage, you also raise the basis for all the other wages. And so increases in minimum wages tend to increase all wages, all hourly wages, all the way up the line. So we have a point here to make. We have a principle to draw. And that is when minimum wage laws are increased, everybody in the economy pays more. Think about this. If it's not just going to be those who have minimum wage workers that have increased costs. It's going to be anyone who pays anyone an hourly wage. So this increase in the minimum is going to push all wages up, and that means that all costs for all businesses go up. And what are owners going to do if all of their costs go up? Eventually, we're going to talk about this more, but one of the things they'll have to do is raise their prices. So we'll talk about some other ramifications of this now. But whenever you raise that wage, you cause all the wages to go up and all prices to go up. And then that decreases the value of that increase. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you double the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15, and you can buy a certain amount of goods with $15 an hour, but now all the goods prices have gone up by 10 or 15%, then your $15 an hour isn't $15 an hour anymore. You see, you really can't ever get caught up because every time you push the bar up, everyone gets a pay raise. So it increases costs. And this leads to eliminating jobs. Eliminating jobs. To maintain competitiveness and profits, owners will eventually cut workers. Owners will eventually cut workers. Think about it. If you're going to double my labor cost or increase it by 30% or 40% or whatever, I'm not necessarily going to be able to go out and get all of that from my customers. If I went out and raised my prices in a restaurant by 20 or 30%, would my customers come back? No, they would find somebody else to buy from, or they would find some other way to spend their eating out dollars. So eventually what happens is when you keep raising minimum wages, you force employers to figure out ways to get rid of employees. In the area that I live in, we have a lot of new convenience stores called Parker's Kitchen. You may have seen these. These are basically just nice convenience stores. But one of the things that's interesting about Parker's Kitchen is they only have maybe 2 or 3 employees in the facility at any one time. All of the purchases are done by kiosks. So you walk in, press some buttons on a screen, and pay for whatever it is that you're buying. Usually there's one person who can work all these registers and make sure that everything is working, and the only other people in the building are in the back working in the kitchen cooking up the food. So why do you think they've done that? They've done that because the cost of labor is so high that they have decided that it is cheaper to use this technology than it is to have workers. So you raise the minimum wage, yes, but you force employers to cut jobs. So if you keep your job, that's great. But over the long term, a lot of people will lose their job as well. So you have to keep that in mind. This is one of the weaknesses. And then finally, businesses end up closing because of severe hikes to minimum wages like this. The firms will, of course, they'll try to cut their costs. They're trying to reduce the cost of their equipment, the cost of their rent, the cost of their materials. They'll cut labor costs. But eventually, some of these folks just will not be able to compete anymore. That price increase that they've had, or cost increase that they have had, will simply overwhelm what they can cut. And the prices that they would need to charge to stay in business are too high for the market. So they end up closing. So these are the ramifications of this idea of a living wage. It's not a good idea. What you want to do is allow the market to determine wage rates. If you're only making $8 an hour, that means you're only worth $8 an hour in economic terms. You can't blame that on your employer, and you don't need to turn to the government to try and force them to raise it because of all of these bad things that happen as a result. The answer is not in someone else. The answer is in yourself. And of course, all of these as well follow rational self-interest. But let me mention a couple of other problems here that are, really want to apply this to your life. This whole idea of young people and students looking for a living wage and sort of making that their goal. The question is $15 an hour enough? Let's think about this. Think about your life and what you want to do with your life and what you need to purchase for you and your family over the long term. Is $15 an hour enough? Now remember, I said that when you raise the minimum wage like that, all prices go up on everything, which means that $15 an hour is probably more like $13.50. So you raise it, but then you lower it because you raise the prices of everything. But if it is $15 an hour, know that $15 an hour is just $31,000 a year in annual pay. Is that enough? I have a daughter who graduated from a 2-year technical college, and she as a paralegal, and she got a job at one of the best law firms in the area, one of the largest law firms in the area, and her pay is $17 an hour starting. So that's a little more than this $31,000 a year. And she cannot live on her own now because she still can't afford to live on her own. She can't afford to pay rent and insurance and buy her groceries and pay her taxes and all the things that she has to do on $17 an hour. And she has no college debt. She has no car debt. She's got no debt at all. So is $15 an hour enough? How much more are we going to raise it? After we get to 15, it'll be 20, and then the call will be for 25 and 30 and 35. And then prices continue to go up, and that causes inflation, and we know that there are problems with inflation. Is 15 enough? It's not enough. If for a couple, that's just $62,000 a year. Now, if you're young and you haven't worked much out in the economy and you don't know how much things cost, you might think that $62,000 is a lot of money. But for a whole family, it isn't. Not even close. Here's an interesting set of figures that I found from Investopedia, and it's about the average income, the median income in different states. And I just pulled a few states here, and I want you to see what the levels of income are in these various states. Remember, we got this $62,400 for a couple. This is the median family income, lower, middle, and upper income. And median means just the one that falls right down the middle. And the lower income bracket in South Carolina, where I live, the lower income is at about $28,000. All right, that's for a family. So if you live by yourself, you're just above that. Middle income is $83,000, almost $84,000, and upper is almost $200,000. And we go down through these states and we see that they are all very similar. But look at this middle income. Now, you want to be middle income? All right, you've got $62,400 at a minimum wage job. That is 25% less than the lowest number here. 25% less. So even when you get to 15 an hour, and again I argue that that's not actually 15 an hour after all the prices go up, you're at $62,400 for your family, and that's 25% less than middle income. So you're still in the lower income. And what happens this? What happens if mom wants to stay at home? What happens if you have children and mom wants to stay at home and take care of the children for a few years or for the entire time that they're in school? Then that money's cut in half. Is $31,200 enough to support a family of 4, say? What if dad gets laid off? Dad gets laid off for a period of 6 months and mom's just working $31,200. That's what we're down to. You see, what I want to encourage you to do is don't set your goals this low. A living wage, you shouldn't even be talking about a living wage if you're taking a class at a college. You should be shooting for this middle or upper income. Shoot for the middle or upper income. Don't set your goals so low. Set your goals higher than this. You don't want just to get the minimum. I'm telling you, the minimum is not enough. There are always things that come up. There are always expenses that come up. You need to be saving. You need to be preparing for emergencies. You need to be preparing for retirement. You need as much income as you can get. Set your goals higher than this. And don't depend on a law from a government to guarantee your success or your income. This is another huge problem with this living wage concept and all these other ideas that we have in socialism of looking to the government to provide for us. This kind of idea locks people into poverty, that we just want to look for a living wage, and we want the government to give us a living wage. We want the government to force someone to give us that wage. Don't do that. Be reliant upon yourself. You live in the nation with the greatest opportunity the world has ever known. Do not wait for some government official to pass a law to help you. Get out there, increase your value, and shoot for those high goals, not the low goal of the living wage. So that's the end of this session. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've gotten some things out of it. And I hope you have a great day. We'll see you at our next session. Thank you.